The fluorescent lights of the packaging plant hummed their mechanical lullaby, the same sound that had marked every night shift for the past 3 years. Carter McKenzie stood at Station 7, his hands moving with the precision of a machine, wrapping cuts of beef in plastic, sealing them, stacking them onto pallets that would roll away into trucks bound for supermarkets across Wyoming. The work required no thought. That was why he had chosen it. Around him, younger men joked and complained, their voices barely registering in his consciousness. Carter had learned long ago how to be present in body while his mind retreated to that quiet place where nothing could touch him. It was a skill he had perfected in the Marines, refined in the desert heat of Afghanistan, and now deployed every night in this cold warehouse that smelled of blood and bleach. The clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m. Another 3 hours until his shift ended. Another 3 hours of wrapping meat, stacking boxes, counting down minutes that meant nothing. His hands never stopped moving. His face never changed expression. The other workers had stopped trying to make conversation with him months ago. They called him Ghost when they thought he could not hear. The name did not bother him. It was accurate enough. When the break whistle blew at 3, Carter walked to the break room and sat alone at the corner table. He did not bring food. He rarely felt hungry anymore. Instead, he drank black coffee from a thermos and stared at the wall, watching the second hand on the clock crawl its circular path. 20 minutes, then back to the line. A younger man, new to the night shift, made the mistake of sitting across from him. The kid could not have been more than 25, still eager, still believing that conversation could bridge the distance between strangers. "Long night, huh?" the kid said. Carter looked at him without speaking. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. The kid shifted in his seat, tried again. "You been here long?" "3 years." The answer came flat, devoid of invitation for further inquiry, but the kid pressed on, perhaps not recognizing the walls when he ran into them. "You like it?" Carter took a sip of coffee, still watching the clock. "It pays." The kid nodded, sensing he was losing ground but not yet willing to surrender. "I'm saving up for college, mechanical engineering. You got plans?" For the first time, Carter turned his full attention to the young man. The kid had hopeful eyes, the kind that had not yet seen enough of the world to understand that some questions have no good answers. Carter felt something flicker in his chest, some ancient memory of what it felt like to have plans, to believe the future held something worth reaching for. Then the feeling passed, leaving only the familiar hollow. "No," Carter said, "no plans." The kid finally understood. He nodded, stood up, took his sandwich to another table. Carter returned his gaze to the wall and finished his coffee in silence. The shift ended at 6. Dawn was breaking over the industrial district as Carter walked to his truck, an old Ford F-150 with rust eating at the wheel wells and a crack in the windshield that spiderwebbed across his line of sight. He had bought it for $800 2 years ago. It ran. That was all that mattered. He drove through empty streets to an apartment complex on the east side of town, a squat brick building with peeling paint in a parking lot full of potholes. His unit was on the second floor, number 2C. 2 rooms, a bathroom with a dripping faucet he had never bothered to fix, a kitchenette with a refrigerator that contained exactly 3 items, a case of beer, a carton of eggs, and a jar of mustard that had been there so long he could not remember buying it. Carter dropped his keys on the counter and walked to the living room, if it could be called that. A couch he had found on the curb, a television that only worked sometimes, a coffee table made from milk crates and a piece of plywood. On the wall, a single photograph in a wooden frame. He stood in front of it for a long moment, as he did every morning when he came home. The photo showed a younger version of himself, hair still dark, smile still easy, arms wrapped around a woman with kind eyes and auburn hair. Ellen, his wife, dead 3 years now. The photo had been taken at their wedding 22 years ago. She wore a simple white dress. He wore his dress blues, fresh back from his first deployment. They looked impossibly young. They looked happy. They looked like people who believed they would grow old together. Carter reached out and touched the frame, his calloused fingers tracing the edge of the glass. He did not cry. He had not cried since the funeral. But every morning he stood here and he looked at her face, and he felt the weight of what he had lost pressing down on him like a physical thing. The cancer had taken her slowly. 6 months from diagnosis to death. 6 months of watching her fade, of holding her hand through chemotherapy sessions that left her hollow and sick, of lying beside her in the dark and listening to her breathe, terrified that each breath might be the last. When the end finally came, it had been almost a relief. Not for him, for her. She had suffered enough. The guilt came later. The knowledge that he had not been there the way he should have been. That his own demons, his own nightmares from the war, had made him distant even when he was sitting beside her hospital bed. That she had died holding the hand of a man who had already started to disappear. Carter turned away from the photograph rack and walked to the refrigerator. He pulled out a beer, twisted off the cap, drank half of it in one long swallow. Then he sat on the couch and stared at the blank television screen, not bothering to turn it on. This was his life now. Work, sleep. The spaces in between filled with silence and beer and the constant background hum of memories he could not escape. He had tried in the beginning to find some kind of purpose. He had gone to the VA meetings for veterans with PTSD. He had sat in circles with other broken men and listened to them talk about their flashbacks, their anger, their inability to adjust to civilian life. But the talking did not help. The talking just made the wounds feel fresh. So he had stopped going. He had stopped trying to fix what could not be fixed. He had accepted that this was what remained. Existence without joy, routine without meaning. Days that blurred together until he could not remember which month it was, let alone what day. He was finishing his second beer when his phone rang. The sound startled him. His phone almost never rang. He had no friends left. His family had given up on him. The only calls he received were from bill collectors and telemarketers. He considered not answering. But something made him reach for it. Some flicker of curiosity about who would call at 6:30 in the morning. The number was unfamiliar. He answered without speaking. "Is this Carter McKenzie?" a woman's voice asked. "Yeah. Mr. McKenzie, my name is Patricia Holbrook. I'm an attorney in Red Hawk, Montana. I'm calling about your father, Robert McKenzie." Carter sat up straighter. He had not heard his father's name spoken aloud in decades. The sound of it hit him like a punch to the sternum. "What about him?" "I'm very sorry to inform you that your father passed away 2 weeks ago. I've been trying to reach you, but the phone number we had on file was disconnected." Carter said nothing. The news should have meant something, should have triggered some response, but he felt only a distant numbness. His father. Dead. They had not spoken in 40 years. Not since the day Carter left Montana with a duffel bag and a one-way bus ticket to basic training. "Mr. McKenzie, are you still there?" "I'm here. Your father left his property to you. A ranch in Montana, approximately 400 acres. As his sole heir, you're entitled to the estate. However, there are some conditions we need to discuss." Carter closed his eyes. A ranch. Of course, the same land that had consumed his father's entire life. The same dirt that had stood between them like a wall neither could climb. "Sell it," Carter said. "Whatever it's worth, sell it and send me a check." Patricia Holbrook paused. When she spoke again, her voice was careful, professional. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. Your father's will contains specific instructions. You must come to Montana in person. You must remain on the property for a minimum of 30 days. Only then will you gain full legal ownership and the right to dispose of the property as you see fit." "That's ridiculous." "It's legally binding. If you refuse, the property reverts to the state. Your father was very clear about his wishes, Mr. McKenzie." Carter stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was climbing over the rooftops of Cheyenne, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. 30 days. 30 days on land he had spent 40 years trying to forget. "Why?" he asked. "Why would he do that?" "Your father didn't confide in me about his reasoning, but he was very insistent. 30 days, Mr. McKenzie. After that, the property is yours to do with as you wish." Carter thought about his life here. The night shifts at the meat plant, the empty apartment, the photograph on the wall. What exactly would he be leaving behind? What exactly did he have that was worth staying for? "When do I need to be there?" "As soon as possible. I'll email you the details. The ranch is located about 15 miles outside of Red Hawk. I'll meet you there to go over the paperwork." She gave him her contact information, her email, her office address. Carter wrote nothing down. He would remember. His memory had always been sharp, even when he wished it were not. When he hung up, he sat for a long time in the growing light, beer warming in his hand, thoughts circling like vultures. His father. The ranch. 40 years of silence ending with this strange command from beyond the grave. 30 days on land that held nothing but ghosts. He should refuse. He should tell the lawyer to do whatever the law required and forget about it. But even as he thought it, he knew he would not. Because beneath the numbness, beneath the careful walls he had built around himself, something stirred. Not hope. Nothing so foolish as hope. But curiosity, perhaps. Or obligation. Or simply the recognition that this life, this half-life of routines and silence, was its own kind of death. Carter stood up and walked to the bedroom. He pulled a duffel bag from the closet, the same bag he had carried through 2 deployments, through a dozen moves, through all the years since he first left Montana. He packed quickly, efficiently, clothes, toiletries, not much else. He had learned long ago to travel light. Before he left, he stood once more in front of Ellen's photograph. He touched the glass, his reflection ghosting over her face. "I'll be back," he said to the empty room. Then he picked up his keys and walked out the door. The drive from Cheyenne to Montana took 14 hours. Carter stopped only for gas and coffee, pushing the old truck north through Wyoming and into the vast emptiness of the high plains. The landscape unfolded around him in shades of brown and gold, endless miles of grassland broken occasionally by distant mountains that rose like broken teeth against the horizon. He had forgotten how big the sky was out here. In the city, buildings cut the sky into manageable pieces. But out here, it stretched overhead in an immense dome that made him feel both insignificant and strangely exposed. No walls, no ceilings, nothing between a man and the infinite. As the hours passed and the miles accumulated, memories began to surface, despite his efforts to keep them buried. He remembered being a boy on this same road, sitting in the passenger seat of his father's truck, watching the landscape roll by while his father drove in silence. Robert McKenzie had never been a talkative man. He communicated in grunts and nods, in the set of his shoulders, in the roughness of his calloused hands. Carter had spent his childhood trying to decode that silence, searching for approval that never quite came. He remembered the ranch itself, though the memories were old and worn smooth by time. The house with its wide porch and creaking floorboards. The barn where he had learned to mend tack and stack hay. The corrals where his father had taught him to ride, putting him on horses before he was big enough to reach the stirrups, letting him fall and get back up without a word of comfort or praise. That was the McKenzie way. You learned by doing. You got tough or you got broken. Carter had chosen a third option. He had left. The argument was still fresh in his mind, even after 40 years. He could still see his father's face, red with anger, jaw set like granite. Could still hear his own voice, younger and sharper, throwing words like weapons. "I'm not spending my life stuck on this ranch. I'm not dying here like you are. You're a McKenzie. This land is your responsibility. I didn't ask for that responsibility. I didn't ask to be born into your prison." His father had struck him then, the only time in his life that Robert McKenzie had raised a hand to his son. The slap had been hard enough to split Carter's lip. They had stood there, breathing hard, staring at each other across a distance that felt suddenly vast. "Get out," his father had said, voice low and cold. "If that's how you feel, get out and don't come back." Carter had packed his bag that night, left at dawn, never looked back. Until now. The sun was setting when he crossed the Montana border. The sky bled red and purple, clouds catching fire in the last light of day. Carter's hands ached from gripping the steering wheel. His back protested from hours of sitting. But he kept driving, following the directions the lawyer had emailed, watching the road signs count down the miles to Red Hawk. The town appeared suddenly out of the gathering dark, a cluster of lights in the vast emptiness. Population 423, according to the faded sign at the town limits. Carter had been gone 40 years and the number had actually decreased. He drove slowly down Main Street, recognizing some of the buildings despite the passage of time. The hardware store where his father had bought nails and wire. The feed store where ranchers gathered to gossip and complain about the weather. The Iron Horse Saloon, still standing, though the sign looked newer and the parking lot was mostly empty. On impulse, Carter pulled into the saloon's lot and killed the engine. His body protested when he climbed out of the truck, joints stiff, muscles cramped. He stretched, feeling vertebrae pop in his spine, then walked to the saloon's entrance. Inside, the place had the same smell he remembered, beer and sawdust and old wood. But the faces were different, younger. The bartender was a woman in her 30s with tattoos running up both arms. She looked up when Carter walked in, gave him the practiced smile of someone who had learned to be friendly to strangers. "What can I get you?" "Whiskey. Neat." She poured it and slid it across the bar. Carter paid, took the glass to a booth in the corner, and sat where he could see the door. Old habits. Even after all these years, he automatically positioned himself with his back to the wall, eyes on the exits. The whiskey burned going down, a welcome heat that spread through his chest. He was halfway through the glass when an old man at the bar turned and looked at him. The man was probably in his 70s, face like weathered leather, eyes sharp and assessing. He studied Carter for a long moment, then said something to the bartender that Carter could not hear. The old man picked up his beer and walked over to Carter's booth. He stood there, not sitting, just looking down with an expression Carter could not quite read. "You're Robert McKenzie's boy." It was not a question. Carter met the man's gaze and nodded slowly. "Thought so. You look like him. Same eyes, same way of holding yourself, like you're ready to fight or run at any second." Carter said nothing. The old man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Name's Vernon McCarthy. Folks call me Red. Your father and I were neighbors for 50 years. He was a stubborn son of a bitch, but I respected him. Sorry for your loss." "Thanks." Red still did not sit. He took a long drink of his beer, eyes never leaving Carter's face. "You planning to stay? Work the ranch?" 30 days, then I'm selling." Something flickered across Red's face. Disappointment, maybe. Or anger. It passed too quickly for Carter to be sure. "That land's been in your family for 3 generations. Then maybe it's time for a new family to have it." Red set his beer down on the table with more force than necessary. "Your father spent his whole life on that property. Died there alone because his only son couldn't be bothered to visit even once in 40 years. And now you're going to sell it like it's nothing." Carter felt anger rising in his chest, hot and familiar. He pushed it down with the ease of long practice. "You don't know anything about me or my father. I know he talked about you. Right up until the end, he talked about you. Hoped you'd come back. Hoped you'd forgive him for whatever the hell happened between you two. He's the one who told me to leave. And you're the one who never came back." The words hung in the air between them. Carter finished his whiskey in one swallow and stood up. He was taller than Red by 3 inches and outweighed him by 40 pounds. But the old man did not back down. "I didn't come here for a lecture from a stranger." "No," Red said. "You came here to collect your inheritance and run, just like you ran 40 years ago." Carter walked past him without another word. He could feel eyes on his back as he left the saloon, could hear the murmur of voices starting up behind him. Let them talk. He would be gone in 30 days. Their opinions meant nothing. He got back in his truck and followed the directions on his phone, driving out of town on a 2-lane highway that quickly became gravel, then dirt. The headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating sagebrush and fence posts and the occasional pair of eyes reflecting from the roadside. The turnoff was marked by a rusty iron gate, half open and sagging on its hinges. A wooden sign, weathered almost to illegibility, read McKenzie Ranch, established. 1952. Carter's grandfather had founded this place. His father had expanded it, and now it would die with Carter's generation. Sold to whoever had the money to take it. He drove through the gate and up a rutted driveway that climbed a gentle rise. At the top, the headlights swept across the remains of his childhood home. Carter stopped the truck and sat there, engine idling, staring at what was left. The house stood like a skeleton against the night sky. The roof had caved in badly on the east side, exposing rafters like broken ribs, though the western portion still clung precariously to the walls. Most of the windows were broken, jagged glass catching the last light. The porch sagged dangerously, boards missing, railings collapsed. What had once been a proud ranch house, built by hand from local timber, now looked like something from a ghost town, abandoned and forgotten, barely held together by stubbornness and luck. Carter killed the engine. The silence rushed in immediately, vast and complete. No traffic sounds, no voices, just the wind moving through the grass and the tick of the cooling engine. He got out of the truck slowly, his boots crunching on gravel. The air smelled different here than in the city. Cleaner, sharper, carrying hints of sage and dust and something else he could not quite name. Memory, perhaps. He walked toward the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. The porch groaned when he put his weight on the first step, and he paused, testing it before committing. The boards held, Barely. He crossed to the front door, which hung crooked in its frame. The door was unlocked. It probably had been for years. Inside, his flashlight beam revealed devastation softened by time, furniture covered in dust and debris, family photos on the walls, their faces obscured by grime. The kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast as a boy, still standing but covered in fallen plaster from the ceiling. Carter moved through the rooms like a ghost visiting his own past. His old bedroom, the narrow bed still there, mattress rotted through. His parents' room, larger but just as destroyed. The living room where his father had sat every evening in a chair by the fireplace, reading agricultural reports and ranch accounts by lamplight. The memories pressed in on him, suffocating in their specificity. He could almost hear his mother's voice calling him for dinner, though she had died when he was 12. Could almost smell his father's coffee, black and bitter, drunk before dawn every morning. Carter backed out of the house, suddenly desperate for air. He stood on the porch, breathing hard, fighting against the tightness in his chest that he recognized as the beginning of a panic attack. He counted his breaths. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The technique the VA therapist had taught him back when he still went to therapy. Slowly, the tightness eased. His heartbeat returned to normal. He became aware of the night around him again, the vast Montana sky overhead, thick with stars that never showed themselves in the city. And then he heard it. A sound from behind the house. Movement. Animals. Carter's hand went automatically to his hip, reaching for a weapon that was not there. Old reflexes from the war. He forced himself to relax, to think. He was on a ranch. Animal sounds were normal. But his father had been dead for 2 weeks. What animals would still be here? He walked around the side of the house, following the sound. Behind the house, set back about 50 yards, stood the barn. It was in better shape than the house, though that was not saying much. The roof sagged but held. The doors hung crooked but intact. And from inside came the unmistakable sound of livestock. Carter approached slowly, his mind racing. This was impossible. His father had been dead for 2 weeks. Before that, he had been alone and aging. Who had been caring for animals? He reached the barn doors and pulled them open. The hinges screamed in protest. Inside, darkness reigned, broken only by the faint moonlight filtering through holes in the roof. Carter pulled out his phone and turned on its flashlight. The beam swept across the interior of the barn, and he froze. There were chickens perched on the rafters, at least a dozen of them, feathers fluffed against the cold. In makeshift pens cobbled together from fallen beams and old fencing, he saw goats and sheep. And in the largest stall, moving nervously at the sudden light, were cattle. He counted quickly, 30 head, maybe more. This was impossible. These animals looked healthy, well-fed, cared for. Carter moved deeper into the barn, his light revealing water troughs that were clean, hay that was relatively fresh, signs of regular maintenance. Someone had been here. Someone had been feeding these animals, caring for them, keeping them alive. A low growl made him spin around. A dog stood in the barn entrance, silhouetted against the night, large with the build of a shepherd mix. Its eyes reflected green in the flashlight beam. The growl came again, deeper this time, a clear warning. Carter stood still, making himself small, non-threatening. He had worked with military dogs in Afghanistan. He knew not to make sudden movements, not to challenge. Easy, he said, his voice low and calm. Easy, boy. The dog took a step forward, still growling. Then it stopped. Sniffed the air. The growl faded to uncertainty. The dog cocked at its head, studying him. That's right, Carter said. I'm not a threat. I'm just trying to figure out what the hell is going on here. A voice spoke from the darkness behind the dog. Duke doesn't bark at strangers like that. Carter's hand went to his hip again, old instincts firing. A figure stepped into the barn, and in the backwash of Carter's flashlight, he saw an old man, probably late 60s or early 70s, wearing a battered cowboy hat and carrying a bucket of feed. The man walked past the dog without fear, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged. He set the bucket down and looked at Carter with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. You must be Robert's boy. Carter lowered his phone slightly, though he kept the light on. Who are you? Name's Hank Dawson. I live on the ranch next door, about 2 miles east. He gestured toward the animals. I've been looking after this place, after these animals, for your father. My father's been dead for 2 weeks. I know. I found him, heart attack, Right there in the house, Hank's voice was matter of fact, but Carter heard the grief underneath. I've been coming every day since then, same as I did before. These animals still need feeding. Carter looked around the barn again, his mind trying to process this. Why? Why would you do that? Hank was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, because I promised your father I would, and because a long time ago your father saved my life. This is me returning the favor. The old man moved to one of the pens and began pouring feed into a trough. The animals crowded forward, and Carter heard the sound of them eating, content and trusting. How long? Carter asked. How long have you been doing this? Hank straightened up, his joints creaking audibly. 15 years, give or take, since your father got too old to manage it all himself. He never asked for help, mind you, but I saw him struggling and I figured I owed him. So I just started showing up. Eventually he stopped protesting. 15 years. Carter felt something twist in his chest, some emotion he could not quite name. His father, alone on this ranch, too proud to ask for help, accepting it only because a neighbor was too stubborn to take no for an answer. He talked about you, Hank said, not looking at Carter. Not a lot, but sometimes. Especially toward the end. He hoped you'd come back. I'm here now. For 30 days. Then you're selling, I'm guessing. It was not a question. Carter said nothing. Hank nodded as if the silence confirmed everything. Well, the old man said, these animals don't care about property disputes or family feuds. They just need feeding. You planning to help with that while you're here, or you just going to wait out your 30 days in town? Carter looked at the animals, at the clean water troughs, at the fresh hay. He thought about his apartment in Cheyenne, the empty rooms, the photograph on the wall. He thought about the meatpacking plant and the fluorescent lights and the endless monotony of nights that all felt the same. I'll help, he heard himself say. Hank looked at him for the first time, really looked, his old eyes sharp and assessing. Then he nodded just once. Good. We start at 5. Don't be late. The old man walked past him, the dog following at his heels. At the barn door, he paused and looked back. Your father left you more than land, boy. He left you a charge. These animals have been here, some of them, since before he died. They survived because someone cared enough to keep showing up. You might want to think about that. Then he was gone, disappearing into the night, leaving Carter alone in the barn with the sound of animals and the weight of words he was not ready to understand. Carter stood there for a long time, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that drifted like snow. Finally, he turned and walked back to his truck. He pulled out his sleeping bag, the one he had carried through 2 deployments, and walked back to the house. He spread the bag on the floor of what had been the living room, in the one corner where the roof was still intact. The floorboards were hard beneath him. The cold seeped up through the sleeping bag, but he had slept in worse places. As he lay there staring up at the broken ceiling and the stars visible through the gaps, Carter thought about the animals in the barn, thought about Hank Dawson keeping a promise to a dead man, thought about his father, alone on this land for 40 years, waiting for a son who never came. He thought about Red's words in the bar. He hoped you'd forgive him. Forgive him for what? For being hard? For being demanding? For slapping him that one time and telling him to leave? Carter had carried his anger for 40 years, had let it calcify into something cold and permanent. But lying here now, in his father's ruined house, he felt the first hairline crack in that old rage. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something softer. A question, perhaps. Had his father been waiting all these years? Had he kept the ranch, kept it going against all odds because he hoped his son would one day return? Carter did not have answers, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wanted them. He closed his eyes and eventually slept. The dream came as it always did, sudden and vivid. He was back in Afghanistan, in the village that had cost him 3 men from his unit. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with dust. He was moving through the narrow streets, rifle up, senses screaming danger. And then the explosion. The shock wave. The screams. Carter woke gasping, his heart hammering, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cold. For a moment he did not know where he was, then memory returned. Montana, the ranch, his father's house. He checked his phone, 4:47 a.m. Close enough? Carter got up, rolled his sleeping bag, and walked outside. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, a pale gray line on the horizon. The air was cold enough that his breath fogged. He stood on the broken porch and watched the dawn come, slow and certain, pushing back the night. At 5 o'clock exactly, he heard the sound of an engine. Headlights appeared on the dirt road, and a truck pulled up next to his. Hank Dawson got out, the dog jumping down beside him. The old man looked at Carter and nodded, as if finding him awake and ready confirmed something. "Let's get to work," was all he said. And Carter, without quite understanding why, followed him to the barn as the sun rose over the McKenzie ranch, casting long shadows across land that had been waiting 40 years for him to come home. The work began before the sun cleared the horizon. Hank moved through the barn with the efficiency of long practice, his weathered hands checking water levels, distributing feed, inspecting each animal with the keen eye of someone who knew what to look for. Carter followed, watching at first, then gradually helping, his body remembering rhythms it had not performed in 40 years. The cattle needed hay, which meant hauling bales from the storage area at the back of the barn. The bales were heavy, 60 pounds each, and Carter's shoulders protested after the first few. But he kept working, sweat beginning to soak through his shirt despite the morning cold. Hank said nothing, just kept moving, kept working, his silence somehow more instructive than any words could have been. The chickens needed grain scattered in their area, fresh water in their containers. The goats required attention to a fence that had come loose, one of them having worked the wire until it bent. Hank produced tools from a battered toolbox, handed Carter a pair of pliers without comment. Together they mended the fence, their hands working in tandem, Hank holding the wire taut while Carter twisted it tight around the post. When the morning feeding was done, the sun had finally climbed above the eastern hills, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Steam rose from the water troughs where warm breath met cold air. The animals settled into their routines, content and calm. Hank straightened up, one hand going to his lower back, a grimace crossing his weathered face. He was old, Carter realized, probably close to 70, too old to be doing this kind of work alone. Yet he had been doing it for 15 years. "Coffee?" Hank asked. It was the first word either of them had spoken since they started work. Carter nodded. Hank walked to his truck and pulled out a large thermos and 2 tin cups that looked like they had survived several wars. He poured black coffee into both cups and handed one to Carter. They stood in silence, drinking coffee as the ranch woke up around them. A light breeze carried the smell of sage and earth. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its voice sharp and lonely. "Your father and I had a routine," Hank said eventually. "I'd come over around 5, help with the morning feeding. Then we'd have coffee, talk about the day's work. He'd usually have a list of things that needed fixing. Always something on a ranch that needs fixing." Carter sipped his coffee, saying nothing. Hank seemed comfortable with silence, did not rush to fill it with unnecessary words. Minutes passed. "He kept this place going longer than anyone thought possible," Hank continued. "After your mother died, folks figured he'd sell, move to town. But he stayed, built it up even, for a while. Then age started catching up with him. Things began to fall apart faster than he could fix them. That's when I started helping more regular." "Why?" Carter asked. The question came out harder than he intended. Why help a man too stubborn to ask for it? Hank looked at him with those sharp old eyes. "You really don't know?" "Know what?" "About what your father did for me. About why I owe him everything." Carter shook his head. Hank was quiet for another moment, staring out at the ranch, at the hills beyond. When he spoke, his voice was softer, touched by memory. "Winter of 1978. Worst blizzard this area had seen in 50 years. I was younger then, stupider. I took my sheep up to the high pasture even though the weather was turning. Got caught when the storm hit. My horse threw me, broke my leg in 2 places. I was bleeding internal, though I didn't know it then. Just knew I was hurt bad and the temperature was dropping fast." Hank paused, took a long drink of coffee. "I would have died up there. Should have died. But your father came looking for me. Don't ask me how he knew where to look. Some men just have that sense about land and weather and when things are wrong. He found me half frozen, delirious. Got me on his horse, got me down off that mountain." Carter waited, sensing there was more. "But that wasn't the hardest part," Hank said. "I was bleeding out, needed blood fast. We were 20 miles from the nearest hospital, and in that storm there was no way we'd make it in time. Your father, he had the same blood type as me. Rare type, O negative. So right there in his barn, he gave me his blood. Set up a direct transfusion, him to me, using veterinary equipment and pure stubbornness." The old man's voice grew rough. "Saved my life. No question about it. When I tried to thank him later, tried to figure out how to repay something like that, he just said, "Men like us don't leave each other behind." That was all. Never mentioned it again. Carter felt his throat close, breath catching. He tried to imagine his father, the hard man who had driven him away, performing such an act of desperate heroism. The image did not fit with the Robert McKenzie he remembered. "So when he got old," Hank continued, "when he started needing help, I didn't ask permission. I just showed up. And when he died, I promised I'd keep showing up until you came back. Because that's what men like us do. We keep our promises." The words hung in the air between them. Carter finished his coffee, the bitter taste mixing with emotions he did not want to examine too closely. "He thought I'd come back? He hoped. That's not quite the same thing, but it's something." Hank collected the cups and walked back to his truck. "I'll be here tomorrow morning, same time. You can help or not. But either way, these animals need feeding." He drove away, leaving Carter standing alone in the morning light, his mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Carter would wake before dawn, often from nightmares that left him gasping and disoriented. He would lie in his sleeping bag on the hard floor, waiting for his heart rate to settle, watching the sky lighten through the gaps in the roof. Then he would rise and walk to the barn where Hank would already be working. They developed a rhythm. Hank would handle the cattle, Carter would take care of the chickens and goats. They would meet at the water troughs, refilling them from the well that still worked, though the pump was temperamental and needed coaxing. After the morning feeding, they would drink coffee and Hank would point out what needed fixing. The list was endless. Fence posts rotted and leaning, barn boards split and warped. The well pump itself, held together with wire and hope. The roof of the house, caved in and dangerous. Every surface showed the wear of 15 years of decline, of one old man trying to hold back entropy through sheer force of will. Carter began to work, not because he planned to stay, he reminded himself, but because the work needed doing and he had nothing better to fill his days. He started with the fences, pulling out rotten posts and replacing them with new wood he found in the barn. Lumber his father must have stockpiled years ago. The physical labor felt good, purposeful. His muscles ached at the end of each day, but it was a clean ache, honest and earned. His hands, soft from the years of factory work, began to toughen again. Blisters formed and broke and formed again, eventually becoming calluses. His back, which had been stiff from nights on the concrete floor of the packing house, started to loosen, adapting to the different demands of ranch work. And slowly, almost without noticing, he began to sleep better. The nightmares still came, but less frequently. Some nights he slept through until the alarm he had set on his phone woke him at 4:30. The first time it happened, he lay there in the darkness, surprised by the unfamiliar feeling of having rested. One morning, about a week after he arrived, Carter was repairing a section of corral fence when Hank's truck pulled up. But this time, Hank was not alone. A second vehicle followed him, a newer pickup with veterinary insignia on the door. A woman got out of the second truck. She was probably in her early 40s, Asian features, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and work boots and carried a medical bag with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Hank walked over with her, and Carter noticed the old man's posture had changed slightly, straighter, more formal, introducing someone who mattered. "Carter, this is Dr. Sarah Chen. She's the vet for most of the ranches in this area. Sarah, this is Carter McKenzie, Robert's son." Sarah extended her hand and Carter shook it. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused. Working hands. "I heard you were back," she said. "I wanted to check on the animals, make sure they're doing okay. Your father was one of my regular clients. I'm sorry for your loss." The words were standard condolence, but she said them with genuine warmth. Carter found himself nodding, accepting them more easily than he had from others. "Hank called me about one of the steers," Sarah continued. "Said he's been favoring his front left leg. Mind if I take a look?" "It's your call," Carter said, then realized how that sounded. "I mean, I'm just here temporarily. Hank knows these animals better than I do." Something flickered in Sarah's expression. Not quite disappointment, but close. She turned to Hank. "Show me?" They walked to the barn together, and Carter found himself following, curious despite his intention to remain detached. Sarah worked with smooth efficiency, approaching the steer slowly, speaking to it in low, soothing tones. The animal allowed her to examine its leg, barely flinching when she probed the swollen joint. Inflammation, she said. Probably stepped wrong and twisted it. I'll give him an anti-inflammatory injection, but he needs to stay off it for a few days. You'll want to keep him separated from the herd, limit his movement. She prepared the injection while talking, her hands steady and sure. Carter watched her work, impressed by the casual competence. When she was done, she straightened up and looked around the barn, taking in the state of repair, the makeshift pens, the patches and fixes that held everything together. Your father did good work here, she said. A lot of ranchers would have given up when things got hard, but Robert kept going, stubborn in the best way. Carter did not know what to say to that. Sarah seemed to sense his discomfort and changed the subject. Hank tells me you're planning to sell after your 30 days. That's the plan. Have you had the property appraised? Not yet. I figured I'd wait until I had legal ownership. Sarah nodded, pulling off her gloves. There's a company that's been buying up ranches in this area. Peak Energy Corporation. They're looking for land to develop for oil and gas extraction. They'll probably make you an offer. Something in her tone made Carter look at her more closely. You don't sound like you think that's a good thing. It's not my place to tell you what to do with your property, Sarah said carefully. But I will say that the ranches they've bought and developed, the land doesn't recover. The extraction process leaves it pretty much unusable for anything else. And it affects the water table, which affects everyone. I'll keep that in mind, Carter said, though he was not sure why it should matter to him. He would be gone in a few weeks. What happened to this land after that was not his concern. Sarah packed up her equipment and walked back to her truck. Before she got in, she turned back to Carter. I come out here every couple of weeks to check on the animals. Hank usually calls if there's something urgent. I knew your father for about 10 years. He was a good man. Difficult, but good. This place mattered to him. She drove away, leaving Carter standing with Hank in the morning sun. She's right, you know, Hank said, about Peak Energy. They've already bought the Morrison Ranch to the north and the Patterson place to the west. Tore them both up, oil derricks and access roads and holding ponds full of chemicals. Nothing grows there anymore. Carter looked out at the land around them, the rolling hills covered in grass and sage, the distant mountains rising like sentinels. He tried to imagine it carved up, industrialized, dead. The image bothered him more than he wanted to admit. I need to check the well, he said, changing the subject. Pump's been making a funny noise. Hank let it drop, but Carter could feel the old man's eyes on him as he walked away. That afternoon, while Hank had gone back to his own ranch for a few hours, Carter decided to explore the house more thoroughly. He had been avoiding it, sleeping in one corner and using the rest as little as possible. But if he was going to be here for 30 days, he needed to know what he was dealing with. He started with the kitchen, which was less damaged than other parts of the house. The old wood stove still stood in the corner, rusty but potentially functional. The cabinets were mostly intact, though the doors hung crooked. Inside, he found dishes covered in dust, canned goods so old they had become artifacts. He moved to what had been his father's bedroom. The bed frame was still there, the mattress long since rotted to nothing. On the nightstand, Carter found a pair of reading glasses, a book about cattle diseases, a Bible that looked like it had never been opened, personal items that spoke of a solitary life, of nights spent alone in a house that had once held a family. On the dresser, covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked like snow, Carter found a photograph in a wooden frame. He picked it up, wiped the glass with his sleeve. The photo showed his mother and father on their wedding day, young and hopeful, standing in front of this very house when it was new and proud. His mother smiled at the camera, beautiful in a simple white dress. His father looked uncomfortable in his suit, but there was something in his eyes, something soft that Carter had never seen in life. He set the photo down and continued searching. In the closet, he found his father's clothes still hanging, flannel shirts and work pants, boots lined up neatly on the floor. In the back, behind a winter coat, Carter's hand touched something solid. He pulled it out, a metal lockbox, about the size of a shoebox, with a simple combination lock. Carter tried a few obvious combinations, his father's birthday, his mother's, the year the ranch was founded. Nothing worked. Then on impulse, he tried his own birthday. The lock clicked open. Inside, Carter found papers, letters, documents, and on top, a small leather notebook, the kind his father used to carry in his shirt pocket. Carter opened it, recognizing his father's handwriting immediately. the cramped, precise script that had filled the margins of agricultural reports and ranch ledgers. It was a journal, not detailed daily entries, but occasional thoughts, observations, things his father had wanted to remember or work through. Carter flipped to the first entry, dated August 1984. Carter left today. Told him to get out, and he did. Part of me thought he'd come back after a few hours once he cooled down. But he got on that bus, and he's gone. Margaret says I should call him, apologize. But I don't know how, never learned how to say I'm sorry, never learned how to say a lot of things. The words hit Carter like a physical blow. He sat down on the floor, the journal in his hands, and began to read. The entries were sporadic, sometimes months apart, but they painted a picture of a man who was not as hard as he seemed, who felt things deeply but had no words for the feeling. February 1991. Heard Carter got married. Some girl named Ellen. Margaret sent me a newspaper clipping from the base newspaper. He looks happy. I'm glad. I never made his mother happy. Maybe he'll do better. October 2003. Carter came home on leave. Brought Ellen to meet me. She's a good woman, kind eyes. But Carter barely looked at me. We talked about the weather and the cattle market and nothing that mattered. He left after 2 days. Ellen hugged me goodbye. Carter shook my hand. I wanted to tell him I was proud, that I think about him every day, but I shook his hand and I watched him drive away. December 2005. Ellen called. Said Carter is having a hard time since he came back from deployment. Nightmares. Anger. She's worried about him, asked if I had advice. What could I say? I raised him hard because that's how I was raised. I thought it would make him strong. Maybe I just made him cold. Carter turned pages, his eyes burning. The entries grew sadder as the years passed. July 2008. Ellen called again. Said Carter is getting help for PTSD. I looked it up at the library. I didn't know it had a name. I just thought it was what happened to men after war. I had it too, I think, after Korea. But we didn't talk about such things back then. We just carried it. November 2021. Ellen died. Margaret told me. Cancer. Carter didn't call. I wanted to go to the funeral, but I don't think he'd want me there. I sat in the church here and said a prayer for her. She deserved better than what she got from our family. The last entry was dated just 6 months ago. March 2025. I'm dying. Doctor says my heart is giving out. Few months, maybe a year. I changed my will today. Left everything to Carter, but with conditions. He has to come here, has to stay for 30 days. I know he'll hate me for it, but maybe if he comes back, if he spends time on this land, he'll understand. I never knew how to tell him I loved him. Maybe the land can tell him for me. Maybe Hank can explain what I never could. I'm leaving him a charge, not an inheritance. These animals, this land, they need someone to care. I failed at a lot of things, but I never failed these animals. If Carter can learn to care for them, maybe he can learn to care for himself again. Maybe he can forgive me. Maybe he can forgive himself. Carter closed the journal, his hands shaking. He sat there on the floor of his father's bedroom, surrounded by dust and memories, and the overwhelming presence of a man he had spent 40 years trying to forget. His father had known about Ellen's death, about the PTSD, about everything, had carried that knowledge in silence, never reaching out, never knowing how. And in the end, had crafted this strange last gift, this mandatory return, this confrontation with a past neither of them had been able to escape. Carter did not cry. He had not cried in years, had trained himself out of tears the way soldiers train themselves out of fear. But he sat there for a long time, the journal in his lap, feeling something crack deep inside him. Not breaking, cracking. The way ice cracks when spring comes, the sound of something frozen beginning to thaw. When he finally stood up, the sun was low in the western sky. He walked out of the house, the journal still in his hand, and found Hank back at the barn, doing the evening feeding. The old man looked up when Carter approached, and something in Carter's face made him pause. You okay? Carter held out the journal. He knew about Ellen, about everything. He knew and he never said anything. Hank took the journal, glanced at it, then handed it back. Robert wasn't good with words, never was, but he cared. He cared more than he knew how to show. He left this place to me as some kind of test, some kind of lesson. Maybe, Hank said, or maybe he left it to you because it was the only thing he had to give, and because he hoped it might do for you what it did for him. What did it do for him? Hank looked out at the land, at the cattle settling down for the night, at the endless sky turning purple and gold. It gave him purpose. It gave him something to care for when he couldn't care for himself. It gave him a reason to get up every morning, even when he didn't want to. Carter thought about his own mornings in Cheyenne, the struggle to find a reason to rise from bed, the empty hours filled with work that meant nothing. He thought about the past week here, waking before dawn, not because he had to, but because the animals needed him. Because Hank would be waiting, because there was work that mattered, even if he did not want to admit it mattered. "I'm still selling," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Hank just nodded. 30 days is a long time. A lot can change. That night, Carter did not sleep in the house. Instead, he pulled his sleeping bag into the barn, finding a spot in the hayloft where the roof was solid and the hay provided insulation against the cold. Below him, he could hear the animals breathing, shifting, settling into sleep. The sounds were oddly comforting, proof of life in the darkness. He lay awake for a long time, the journal beside him, thinking about his father. Trying to reconcile the hard man he remembered with the uncertain, grieving man revealed in those pages. Trying to understand how someone could care so deeply and show it so poorly. Eventually, sleep came, and for the first time since he arrived, Carter did not dream of war. Instead, he dreamed of his mother, young and smiling, calling him in for dinner. He dreamed of his father, teaching him to ride, hands rough but steady, voice gruff but patient. He dreamed of a time before the anger, before the distance, when this ranch had been home and family had meant something simple and good. He woke to the sound of Hank's truck pulling into the yard. The sun was just beginning to rise. Carter climbed down from the loft, brushed hay from his clothes, and walked out to meet another day. Over breakfast, which consisted of coffee and some protein bars Hank had brought, the old man mentioned that Sarah Chen would be coming back that afternoon. "She wants to check on that steer again, make sure the inflammation is going down. Also said she might bring her boy with her." "Her boy?" "Ethan. He's about 12, I think. Good kid, but he's got some challenges. Doesn't talk much. Sarah says he's on the spectrum, whatever that means exactly. But he's gentle with animals. Sometimes she brings him when she makes her rounds, lets him help." Carter nodded, not particularly interested but not wanting to be rude. He had enough to deal with without adding other people's children to the mix. But when Sarah arrived that afternoon and a small boy climbed out of her truck, something made Carter pause. The kid was slight, with dark hair like his mother and eyes that did not quite meet anyone's gaze. He stood close to Sarah, one hand gripping her jacket, clearly uncomfortable with the new environment. Sarah noticed Carter watching. "Ethan has autism. He doesn't do well with new people or places, but he loves animals. I hope it's okay that I brought him." "It's fine," Carter said, surprised to find he meant it. They walked to the barn together, Ethan staying close to his mother. But when they entered and the boy saw the animals, something changed. His grip on Sarah's jacket loosened. He took a step forward, then another, drawn by curiosity that overcame his fear. A young calf, born just a few days ago, according to Hank, stood in one of the pens. Ethan moved toward it slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. The calf watched him approach, ears forward, curious but not afraid. Ethan reached out one hand. The calf sniffed it, then allowed itself to be touched. And for the first time since they arrived, the boy smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but Sarah caught her breath. Carter saw tears spring to her eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. "He doesn't smile often," she said quietly. "But animals, they get through to him when nothing else can." They stood watching as Ethan slowly, gently, ran his hand along the calf's neck, his face transformed by wonder and connection. Carter felt pressure build behind his ribs, an unfamiliar warmth. This boy, this damaged, struggling boy, finding peace here among the animals, finding something he could not find in the regular world. It reminded Carter of himself, of how the work here had begun to quiet the noise in his own head. "He can come visit any time," Carter heard himself say. "If it helps." Sarah turned to look at him, surprise and gratitude in her expression. "Really? Why not? I'm here for a few more weeks anyway. If it helps the kid, he's welcome." "Thank you," Sarah said, and the warmth in her voice made Carter uncomfortable. He had done nothing worth thanking. He was just a man killing time on his dead father's ranch, waiting out a mandatory sentence before he could leave and forget this place existed. But as he watched Ethan with the calf, watched the boy's careful gentleness and the animal's trusting acceptance, Carter wondered if maybe that was not entirely true anymore. That evening, after Hank had gone home and Sarah had taken Ethan back to town, Carter sat on the porch of the ruined house and watched the sun set over the Montana hills. The journal lay beside him, and he picked it up again, reading through the entries he had skimmed before. Buried in the middle pages, he found something else. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Carter opened it carefully. It was a letter written in his father's hand but never sent. The date at the top read December 2021, right after Ellen's death. Dear Carter, I heard about Ellen. I am so sorry. I know what it is to lose a wife. Your mother was the best thing that ever happened to me, and when she died, I did not know how to go on. But I did go on because that is what we do. We endure. I wish I could tell you it gets easier. It does not. But it becomes bearable. In this land, these animals, they help. They need you regardless of how you feel. They do not care about your grief. They just need to be fed and watered and cared for. And in caring for them, you remember how to care about something again. I know you will not call me. I know I am the last person you would turn to. I understand. I was not a good father. I was hard when I should have been soft. I was silent when I should have spoken. I drove you away because I did not know how to hold you close. But if you ever need a place to heal, to find your footing again, this ranch is here. It will always be here. And so will I, for as long as I am able. Your father. Carter read the letter 3 times, each word settling into him like stones into water, sinking deep. His father had written this 2.5 years ago, had carried it with him perhaps, never finding the courage to send it, or perhaps knowing that Carter would not have read it even if it arrived. But now Carter was reading it. Now, sitting on the porch of his father's house, surrounded by the land that had shaped them both, he finally understood what his father had been trying to say. The ranch was not a prison. It was an offer of sanctuary, a place where broken things could heal if they were willing to do the work. Carter folded the letter carefully and put it back in the journal. Then he stood up and walked to the barn, where tomorrow's work waited, where animals depended on him showing up, regardless of how he felt, where the land asked nothing of him except that he care. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, Carter McKenzie began to understand that maybe, just maybe, caring was exactly what he needed to learn how to do again. 2 weeks had passed since Carter arrived at the ranch, and the rhythm of the work had become as natural as breathing. He woke before dawn without needing an alarm, his body attuned now to the cycles of the land. The animals expected him. Hank expected him. And somewhere along the way, Carter had started expecting himself to show up. The changes were small, but accumulating. The fences he had repaired stood straight and strong. The water pump, after 3 days of cursing and improvisation, now ran smoothly. The chicken coop had a new roof, patched together from salvaged tin and determination. The work was never finished, but progress was visible, tangible, real. Carter's body had changed too. The softness from years of sedentary factory work had burned away, replaced by lean muscle and endurance. His hands were permanently stained now, calloused so thick that barbed wire barely registered. When he looked in the mirror each morning, shaving with cold water from the pump, he saw a face that was leaner, harder, but somehow less haunted than the one that had left Cheyenne. Sarah had made good on bringing Ethan back to visit. Twice a week after she finished her rounds at other ranches, she would stop by with the boy. Ethan never spoke, not to Carter, not to Hank, sometimes not even to his mother. But with the animals, he transformed. He would spend hours in the barn, sitting quietly near the cattle, brushing the horses, scattering grain for the chickens with a focus and peace that seemed impossible for him to find anywhere else. Carter found himself looking forward to those visits, not because of Sarah, though he had come to respect her quiet competence and genuine warmth, but because of Ethan. Because watching the boy find solace among the animals reminded Carter of why he kept showing up each morning. These creatures needed care, and in needing care, they gave purpose to those who provided it. On this particular morning, Carter was in the far pasture checking the cattle when he heard the sound of an engine that was not Hank's familiar truck. He turned to see a black SUV navigating the rough dirt road, too clean and too expensive for ranch country. The vehicle pulled up near the house, and 2 men in business casual clothing stepped out, looking profoundly out of place. Carter walked back toward them, taking his time, watching the way they scanned the property with evaluating eyes. Predators assessing prey. He had seen that look before, in different contexts, and it never meant anything good. The older of the 2 men, maybe 50, with graying hair and a smile that did not reach his eyes, extended his hand as Carter approached. Mr. McKenzie, I'm Richard Vance, Regional Director for Peak Energy Corporation. This is my associate, Tom Brenner. We were hoping to have a few minutes of your time. Carter shook the offered hand briefly, then crossed his arms. I'm listening. Vance gestured at the land around them with the sweeping confidence of someone used to controlling conversations. Beautiful property. Your father built something special here. We understand you've recently inherited the ranch, and we wanted to extend our condolences. We also wanted to make you aware of an opportunity. What kind of opportunity? Tom Brenner pulled a folder from his briefcase and handed it to Carter. Inside was a formal offer letter, typed on expensive letterhead, with numbers that made Carter's breath catch despite himself. $2.8 million, Vance said, watching Carter's face. Cash offer, quick close. We handle all the paperwork, all the details. You could be done with this place in 30 days and set for life. Carter looked at the number again. 2.8 million, more money than he had ever imagined having. Enough to never work another day at the meatpacking plant. Enough to buy a house, a new truck, maybe travel, do all the things he had stopped dreaming about after Ellen died. Why so much? He asked, his voice careful. This place is falling apart. Vance's smile widened. We're not buying it for the structures. We're buying it for what's underneath. Geological surveys show this area sits on top of substantial oil shale deposits. With modern extraction techniques, this land is worth developing. Fracking. Hydraulic fracturing, yes, it's completely safe, heavily regulated, and it would bring jobs to this area, economic development. Everyone benefits. Carter thought about what Sarah had said about the ranches to the north and west that Peak Energy had already bought, about land that would never recover. He looked at Vance's expensive watch, his polished shoes already dusty from the short walk from the car. He looked at Brenner, who was taking photographs of the property with his phone, probably for evaluation purposes. I'll think about it, Carter said, closing the folder. Vance's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. Take your time. But I should mention that our offer is time-sensitive. We have other properties we're considering. If you're interested, we'd need to know within the week. A week. Market conditions change quickly in our industry, Mr. McKenzie. This is a generous offer, more generous than you're likely to receive from anyone else. I'd hate for you to miss this opportunity by waiting too long. It was a threat wrapped in politeness, and they both knew it. Carter handed the folder back. I said I'll think about it. You have a number where I can reach you? Vance produced a business card. Call anytime, day or night. We're very motivated to make this work. They left, the SUV kicking up dust as it navigated back down the road. Carter stood holding the business card, feeling its weight despite it being nothing but paper and ink. $2.8 million, a fortune, a way out. Hank's truck appeared on the road about 10 minutes later. The old man got out, glanced at the tire tracks from the SUV, then looked at Carter with knowing eyes. Peak Energy? How'd you know? They've been sniffing around every ranch in the county, made offers to most folks. Some took it. Hank spat into the dust. Those that did regret it now. Carter told him about the offer, about the dollar amount. Hank's expression did not change. That's a lot of money, the old man said. It is. Enough to set you up comfortable for the rest of your life. Yeah. Hank walked to the fence line and leaned against a post, looking out at the cattle grazing in the morning sun. Your father got an offer from them too, about 5 years back. Maybe $1 million then, not as much as they're offering you now. He told them to get off his land and not come back, because he was sentimental about the place, because he knew what they'd do to it. Come here, I want to show you something. Hank drove them north in his truck, about 20 miles to what had once been the Morrison Ranch. Carter had vague memories of the Morrison family from his childhood, of their daughter who had been in his grade at school. The ranch had been prosperous then, well-maintained, a showcase of what hard work and good land could produce. What he saw now looked like an industrial wasteland. Oil derricks rose like skeletal fingers against the sky. Access roads carved through what had been pasture, the earth scraped raw and lifeless. Holding ponds lined with plastic and filled with chemicals reflected the sun in oily rainbows. The air smelled of petroleum and something acrid that made Carter's eyes water. This was all grassland 2 years ago, Hank said. Morrison took Peak's money, moved to Arizona, thought he was getting out while the getting was good. But his neighbors got the pollution. The runoff from those holding ponds got into the groundwater. 3 ranches downstream had their wells go bad. Cattle got sick. Two families had to abandon their places because the water wasn't safe anymore. Carter stared at the devastation. This had been someone's heritage, someone's legacy. Now it looked like a scar on the earth, a wound that would never heal. Peak doesn't care about this land, Hank continued. They'll extract what they want and move on. Leave behind poison and empty promises. And the people who live here, who depend on this land for their livelihood, they're the ones who'll pay the price. They drove back in silence. Carter kept seeing those oil derricks in his mind, kept imagining them rising from his father's land, from the pastures where cattle now grazed, from the barn where Ethan found peace with the animals. $2.8 million. And all it would cost was everything that mattered. That afternoon, Carter was repairing a section of the barn wall when he heard shouting from outside. He dropped his hammer and ran, emerging into the yard to find chaos. A section of the perimeter fence had collapsed, probably rotted through and finally giving way. Half the cattle had wandered through the and they were spreading out across the unfenced range, heading toward the road. If they reached the highway, they would be hit by cars, killed, or cause accidents that could kill others. Hank was already on horseback, one of the older geldings from the stable, trying to turn the lead cattle back. But he was one man and the herd was scattering. Carter ran to the stable and grabbed the first horse he could reach, a mare he had been working with for the past week. He swung himself onto her back. No saddle, no time, just the halter rope for control. The horse danced nervously, feeling his urgency, but responded when he pressed his heels to her flanks. They took off across the pasture, Carter leaning low over the mare's neck, his body remembering skills he had learned as a boy. The wind tore at his face, the ground blurred beneath them, and for a moment there was nothing but speed and purpose and the raw exhilaration of the ride. He caught up to a group of 5 cattle that had broken off from the main herd, heading for a draw that would take them toward the highway. Carter pushed the mare between them and their destination, turning them, using his body and voice to redirect their momentum. The cattle, confused but responsive to the pressure, began to turn back toward the ranch. It took an hour. Carter and Hank working in tandem, riding hard, shouting themselves hoarse, pushing the cattle back through the and into the secure pasture on the other side. By the time the last one was through and they had rigged a temporary fix for the fence, both men were exhausted, soaked with sweat despite the cool air. They sat on the ground, backs against the barn, too tired to move. The horses stood nearby, heads down, flanks heaving. "Haven't ridden like that in 40 years, Carter said, his voice rough. Hank laughed, a sound like gravel sliding. "You look like you were born doing it. Your father would have been proud." Carter closed his eyes, feeling the ache in muscles he had forgotten he had. His heart was still racing, adrenaline slowly fading. And underneath the exhaustion was something else. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy at having done something that mattered, that required everything he had to give. "I don't want to sell," he said, the words coming out before he had consciously decided to say them. Hank was quiet for a moment. "The peak energy offer?" "Yeah, that's a lot of money to turn down." "I know." Carter opened his eyes and looked at the land around them, at the cattle now safely contained, at the barn he had been repairing, at the mountains rising in the distance. "But what would I do with the money? Buy another empty apartment in another empty city? Work another meaningless job until I die?" "You could do anything, travel, retire, live comfortable." "I've been comfortable. Comfortable is just another word for numb." Carter stood up, his legs protesting. "My father left me this place for a reason. I'm starting to think I understand what that reason was." That evening, Sarah brought Ethan for their regular visit. But this time, when she got out of her truck, her face was troubled. "I need to talk to you about something," she said, glancing at Ethan, who had already wandered toward the barn. "It's about Ethan." They walked to the house far enough that the boy could not hear. Sarah leaned against the porch railing, her professional composure cracking slightly. "His school called me yesterday. They're recommending a special residential program, a school for kids with severe autism. It's in Seattle, very expensive, very intensive. They think it's the best option for him." "You don't agree?" "I don't know. Maybe they're right. Maybe he needs more than I can give him. But it would mean sending him away, seeing him only on holidays and summer breaks. He's my son. The thought of not having him with me." Her voice broke. Carter watched Ethan through the barn door, saw him sitting quietly beside one of the calves, his hand resting on its flank, his face peaceful in a way that seemed impossible anywhere else. "He's happy here," Carter said. "I know. That's what makes this so hard. He struggles everywhere except here. With the animals, he's at peace. It's the only place I've ever seen him truly relaxed." Sarah wiped her eyes roughly. "I'm sorry, this isn't your problem. I shouldn't burden you with it." "It's not a burden." The words surprised him, but they were true. "Bring him here as often as you want, every day if it helps. He's not bothering anything, and it's good having him around." Sarah looked at him with something like wonder. "Why are you doing this? You barely know us." Carter thought about how to answer, about his father's journal, about the letter that was never sent, about the idea that a place could heal people if they let it, about his own slow transformation from empty shell to something that felt almost human again. "Because he needs it," Carter said simply, "and because I think I need it too." That night, after Sarah and Ethan had left, after Hank had gone home, Carter sat on the porch with his father's journal. He had been reading through it slowly, savoring the entries, getting to know the man who had written them. Tonight, he found an entry from 1999, about 10 years after Carter had left. "Saw a wild horse today, out in the far pasture. Black stallion, probably 4 or 5 years old, strong and fast. Tried to approach him, but he wanted nothing to do with humans. Can't blame him. Freedom is hard to give up, even when captivity might be easier." Carter stared at those words. Freedom is hard to give up, even when captivity might be easier. His father had been writing about a horse, but Carter heard his own story in those lines. He had run from the ranch because it felt like a prison. He had spent 40 years free, and what had that freedom given him? Loneliness, purposelessness, a life so empty it barely qualified as living. The next morning, Carter asked Hank about the wild horse. "Raven," Hank said, "black stallion, lives out in the high country. Your father tried for years to gentle him. Never could. Horse won't let anyone near him. Smart though, tough. Survived out there on his own for 15 years now, maybe longer." "I want to try." Hank raised an eyebrow. "Try what?" "To work with him, to see if he'll trust me." The old man studied him for a long moment. "That horse represents something to you." It was not a question, but Carter answered anyway. "Maybe, or maybe I just want to see if it's possible. If something wild can choose to come close without losing what makes it free." Hank told him where Raven usually ranged, a section of high pasture about 3 miles from the main ranch. Carter started going there every afternoon after the main work was done. He would sit on a rock outcropping and wait, not approaching, not calling, just being present. For 3 days, he saw nothing. On the 4th day, Raven appeared. The horse was magnificent, bigger than Carter had imagined, probably 16 hands, with a coat so black it seemed to absorb light. Raven stood on a ridge about 200 yards away, watching Carter with clear suspicion. Carter did not move, did not try to approach. He just sat, letting the horse see him, letting the horse decide. After 10 minutes, Raven turned and disappeared. Carter came back the next day, and the next. Each time Raven appeared, watched from a distance, then left. But each time, the distance was slightly less. 200 yards became 150, 150 became 100. On the 8th day, Carter brought an apple. He set it on a rock about 20 feet from where he sat, then retreated to his usual spot. Raven approached, cautious but curious. He sniffed the air, took a few steps closer, then, with a sudden decision, darted forward, grabbed the apple, and retreated. Carter smiled. It was progress. 2 weeks into his vigil with Raven, Carter received a phone call. The number was the one from Richard Vance's business card. "Mr. McKenzie, I'm calling to follow up on our offer. Have you had a chance to consider it?" Carter looked out at the ranch, at the work he had done, at the cattle grazing peacefully in the repaired pastures. "I have. And? I'm not interested in selling." There was a pause. When Vance spoke again, his voice had lost its friendly warmth. "I see. May I ask why?" "Our offer is extremely generous." "Because this land isn't for sale, not to you, not to anyone." "Mr. McKenzie, I don't think you understand the economic realities here. This ranch is failing. It's been declining for years. You're one man trying to hold together something that's falling apart. Our offer gives you a way out with dignity and financial security." "I don't want out." Another pause, longer this time. "We could go to court, challenge your father's will, the conditions attached to it, make this very difficult for you." Carter felt anger rising, cold and hard. "You do what you need to do, but I'm not selling." He hung up before Vance could respond. That afternoon, Hank found him working on the barn roof, replacing rotted shingles. Heard you told Peak Energy to pound sand, the old man said. News traveled fast in small towns. Carter hammered in another nail. Word gets around. They're not going to take that well. Peak doesn't like being told no. Then they're going to be disappointed. Hank climbed up onto the roof, moving carefully despite his age. He sat on the peak, looking out at the land. You know what you're choosing here, right? Choosing to stay means this becomes your life. Early mornings, hard work, no guarantees. This ranch barely makes enough to sustain itself. You'll be trading security for struggle. I've had security. It felt like dying slowly. And this? Carter set down his hammer and sat beside Hank. Together, they looked at the land spreading out below them, the pastures and hills and distant mountains. This feels like living. Maybe for the first time in a long time. Hank nodded slowly. Your father hoped you'd say something like that, not in words exactly, but it's what he hoped for. Did he tell you that? Didn't have to. I saw it in how he kept this place going, even when it made no sense to. He was keeping it alive for you, waiting for you to come back and understand what it meant, what it could mean. They sat in comfortable silence, two men who had learned to communicate in the spaces between words. Finally, Hank spoke again. There's something you should know about your father and me, about why I really owe him. Carter waited, sensing this was important. I told you he saved my life in that blizzard. That's true, but there's more to it. Hank's voice grew rough. I was up in those mountains because I was running. My wife had just left me, took our daughter, said I was too hard, too cold, that she couldn't live with a man who showed nothing. I was angry, hurt, stupid. I went up there thinking maybe I'd just stay, let the cold take me. He paused and Carter saw the old man's hands trembling slightly. When your father found me, I was half frozen, bleeding out. And you know what he said? Nothing. He just got me on his horse, got me down to safety, gave me his blood, saved my life. And when I was recovering, when I tried to explain what I'd been thinking up there, he just said, don't matter what you were thinking. You're here now. That means you've got work to do. Hank turned to look at Carter directly. He gave me a reason to live by giving me something to care for. And I've been trying to pass that forward ever since. That's why I helped him with this ranch. Why I'm helping you now. Because caring for something outside yourself, that's what keeps us going when nothing else will. Carter felt the words settling into him, finding places that had been empty for too long. He never told me any of this. Never told me about you, about what happened. He wasn't good with words, but he was good with actions. And he left you this place, not as a burden, but as a gift, a chance to learn what he learned. That purpose doesn't come from comfort or security. It comes from having something worth protecting. That evening, Carter returned to the high pasture where Raven ranged. He had been visiting every day for 2 weeks now, and the horse had grown accustomed to his presence. Today, Raven stood only 30 feet away, close enough that Carter could see the intelligence in his dark eyes, the way his ears tracked every movement. Carter sat on his usual rock and pulled an apple from his pocket, but instead of setting it down, he held it out in his palm, arm extended, offering. Raven watched him for a longer time. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the smell of sage and earth. And slowly, so slowly it seemed like a dream, Raven took a step forward. Then another, and another. The horse's nostrils flared, testing the air, testing Carter's intent. Carter remained absolutely still, barely breathing, his arm beginning to ache from holding the position. But he did not move. Raven's muzzle stretched toward the apple. Hot breath warmed Carter's palm. And then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible from such a powerful creature, the horse took the apple. Carter felt tears sting his eyes. Not just because a wild horse had chosen to trust him, but because he understood what it meant. That trust had to be earned. That freedom and connection were not opposites, but could exist together. That some things were worth the patience and struggle. That night, lying in his sleeping bag in the barn loft, listening to the animals settling below him, Carter thought about the choices he had made, about turning down millions of dollars, about committing to a life of hard work with no guarantee of success, about choosing this land, these animals, this purpose over the emptiness of security. And for the first time since Ellen died, Carter McKenzie felt something like peace. The ranch was still falling apart. The work was still endless. The future was still uncertain. But he had something worth waking up for, something worth protecting, something worth the struggle. His father had known what he needed before Carter knew it himself, had left him not money or comfort, but a charge, a responsibility, a reason to care. And in accepting that charge, Carter had found what he had been looking for without knowing he was searching. A way home, a way back to himself, a way to live again. The weather changed on the 23rd day of Carter's stay. He woke to a sky the color of old bruises, low clouds pressing down on the land like a physical weight. The air felt thick and electric, charged with the promise of violence. The animals sensed it too. The cattle bunched together nervously in the pasture, the chickens refused to leave the coop, and even the dogs stayed close to the barn, whining softly. Hank arrived earlier than usual, his truck bouncing over the rutted road at a speed that suggested urgency. He climbed out and stood looking at the sky, his weathered face grave. "Big one coming," he said without preamble. "Weather Service says it's the worst system they've seen in 30 years. Heavy snow, high winds, temperature dropped to 20 below. Could last 2, maybe 3 days." Carter looked at the clouds, seeing them build and darken to the north. When? Tonight, maybe sooner. Hank turned to survey the ranch with calculating eyes. "We need to prepare. Get every animal into shelter. Secure anything that can blow away. Stock up on feed and water. If we lose power, we'll lose the well pump." They worked through the morning with desperate efficiency. Carter hauled bales of hay into the barn until his shoulders screamed. They filled every container they could find with water, knowing the well might freeze despite the heater Hank rigged around the pump house. They moved the cattle into the large barn, cramming them into every available space. Body heat better than any furnace when the real cold came. Sarah arrived around noon in her truck, Ethan beside her. Her face showed the same concern Carter had seen in Hank's. "I heard about the storm," she said. "I wanted to make sure you were prepared, and I wanted to get Ethan before the roads become impassable." But Ethan was already out of the truck, heading toward the barn where his favorite calf waited. Sarah called after him, but the boy did not respond, lost in his own world. "He won't want to leave," she said, resignation in her voice. Carter watched the boy disappear into the barn. "Let him stay. If the storm is as bad as they're saying, you shouldn't be driving back to town anyway. Stay here, both of you." Sarah started to protest, then looked at the sky. "I don't want to impose." "You're not. The house is falling apart, but the barn is solid. We'll ride it out together." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of trust, of connection. Sarah nodded. "Okay, let me get our things." By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up, gusting hard enough to rattle the barn doors. The temperature was dropping fast, and the first snowflakes began to fall, small and hard as sand. Hank had gone back to his ranch to secure his own animals, promising to return before the worst hit. Carter worked alone, doing a final check of the fences, the barn, the house. He was in the stable making sure the horses had enough hay when he heard the sound, a sharp crack followed by splintering wood. He ran outside to find that a dead tree on the edge of the property had come down, crushing a section of the perimeter fence. And through the gap, he saw movement. Raven, the wild stallion, stood just beyond the broken fence, watching the ranch with what looked like calculation. The approaching storm must have driven him down from the high country, searching for shelter. For nearly 3 weeks, Carter had been building trust with the horse, feeding him apples, sitting with him in silence. But Raven had never come this close to the buildings, had never willingly entered what must seem like captivity. Now the horse paced along the fence line, clearly agitated. The storm was coming, and even wild things knew when to seek protection. Carter approached slowly, hands visible, voice low and calm. "Easy, boy, you can feel it coming. Can't you? It's going to be bad." Raven tossed his head, eyes rolling white. Every instinct was probably screaming at him to run, to find shelter in the wild, and to trust nothing human. But the storm was already upon them, snow falling harder now, visibility dropping. "Come on," Carter said, moving toward the gap in the fence. "I won't trap you. I won't break you. But you need shelter. And I've got it. Just this once, trust me." For a long moment, horse and man stared at each other across the churned snow. Then, with a decision that seemed to cost him everything, Raven stepped through the gap. Carter walked backwards slowly, leading the horse toward the stable. Every step was agony, expecting Raven to bolt at any moment. But the stallion followed, head high, muscles tense, but following. When they reached the stable, Carter opened the largest stall, the one that had stood empty. Raven entered, turned in a tight circle, then stood in the corner as far from the door as he could get. Carter forked hay into the stall, filled the water bucket, then stepped back. "You're free to go whenever you want, but for now, you're safe." He closed the stall door, but did not latch it, leaving Raven the choice. Then he ran back to the fallen tree and began the hard work of dragging debris to cover the gap in the fence, securing it as best he could before the storm made such work impossible. By the time Hank returned, the snow was falling in sheets, driven by wind that howled like something alive and angry. They gathered in the barn, Carter, Hank, Sarah, and Ethan, along with all the animals. The barn had become an ark, a small island of warmth and life in the rising sea of winter's fury. They had moved supplies into the barn's small office, a room barely 10 feet square but insulated and heated by a small wood stove. Hank had brought sleeping bags, food, extra fuel. They would live here until the storm passed, however long that took. Night fell, though it was hard to tell through the white curtain of snow that erased the world beyond the barn walls. The wind screamed around the building, testing every board, every nail, looking for weakness. The animals shifted and lowed nervously, but the presence of humans seemed to calm them, as if they understood they were all in this together. Ethan sat in the corner of the office, wrapped in a sleeping bag, watching the adults with his usual silent intensity. Sarah prepared a simple meal on a camp stove, soup from cans, bread that was already going stale. They ate in near silence, conserving energy, listening to the storm rage outside. "I've seen bad storms," Hank said quietly, "but this one feels different, angrier." Carter knew what he meant. There was a violence to this weather that felt personal, as if the land itself was testing them, measuring their resolve. Around midnight, the power died. They had expected it, but the sudden plunge into darkness still brought a moment of fear. Carter lit the lanterns they had prepared, their warm glow pushing back the shadows. In the stalls beyond the office, the cattle shifted and moaned, sensing the change. "I need to check on them," Carter said, rising. "I'll come with you," Hank said. They moved through the barn with lanterns held high, checking each stall, each animal. Most were settling down, huddled together for warmth. But in the far corner, one of the cows was in distress, pacing and bellowing, her sides heaving. "She's in labor," Hank said, moving closer, "and it's not going well." Carter could see the problem immediately. The calf was breech, coming wrong, and the cow was exhausted from trying to push. In a normal situation, they would call Sarah's veterinary colleagues, get professional help. But in this storm, they were on their own. Sarah appeared beside them, having followed them from the office. She assessed the situation with one glance and immediately took charge. "We need to turn the calf. I'll need help. Carter, hold the lantern steady. Hank, I need you to keep her calm." What followed was an hour of desperate, delicate work. Sarah's arms disappeared inside the cow, feeling blindly for the calf's position, trying to shift it while the mother's contractions fought against her. Sweat poured down Sarah's face despite the cold. Her jaw was set with fierce concentration, hands working with the precision born of years of practice. Carter held the lantern, watching Sarah work, struck by her competence and courage. This was no easy procedure, even in a clean, well-lit clinic. In a barn during a blizzard with only lantern light and determination, it bordered on miraculous. "Got it," Sarah gasped finally. "I've got the front legs. Now we pull, gentle but firm, timing it with her contractions." Together, Carter and Hank pulled while Sarah guided, all three of them straining against biology and bad luck. The cow bellowed in pain and fear, and then suddenly the calf came free, sliding out in a rush of fluid onto the hay. For a terrible moment, it did not move. Then Sarah was on it, clearing its mouth and nostrils, rubbing its chest vigorously. "Come on, baby, come on." The calf coughed, choked, then drew in a shuddering breath. Its eyes opened, seeing the world for the first time through the amber glow of lantern light. The mother, exhausted but responding to instinct, turned and began to lick her newborn clean. Sarah sat back on her heels, breathing hard, covered in blood and birth fluids, and not caring one bit. He's going to make it. Carter felt something break open in his chest. Life, triumphant despite everything. Despite the storm, despite the cold, despite all the ways the world tried to crush what was fragile and new. This calf had chosen to be born in the middle of a blizzard, had fought its way into existence, and had won. They cleaned up as best they could, made sure the mother and calf were stable, then returned to the office. Ethan had fallen asleep in the corner, curled up in his sleeping bag. Sarah went to check on him, brushing hair back from his forehead with a tenderness that made Carter look away, the gesture too intimate to witness. Hank put more wood in the stove and they sat warming their hands, listening to the storm try to tear the barn apart. Your father delivered plenty of calves in weather just like this, Hank said. He used to say that's when you find out what you're made of. When everything is against you and you still have to show up. Carter thought about his father, alone on this ranch for so many years, facing storms and struggles without anyone to help, without anyone to witness. The loneliness of it struck him with fresh force. Why did he stay? Carter asked. After my mother died, after I left, why didn't he just sell and move on? Hank was quiet for a long time, staring into the stove's glowing belly. I asked him that once. You want to know what he said? Carter nodded. He said, because something has to survive. If not me, then the land. If not the land, then the animals. We keep going because giving up is too easy, and easy never made anything worth having. The words settled over them like snow, accumulating weight with silence. Outside, the wind reached a new pitch of fury, and somewhere in the barn, something metal tore free and clanged against the wall. The animals stirred nervously, but held. Around 3 in the morning, the real cold came. The temperature inside the barn dropped despite the wood stove and the body heat of so many animals. Carter could see his breath hanging in the air. His fingers ached even inside his gloves. He thought about the calf, so recently born, so vulnerable. I'm going to check on them again, he said. This time Sarah came with him, leaving Hank to watch over Ethan. They moved through the barn, their breath frosting, their lantern casting wild shadows that danced with every gust of wind that penetrated the walls. The mother cow and her calf were pressed together, sharing warmth. The calf was nursing, a good sign. But Carter could see the calf shivering, its small body not yet ready for cold this extreme. We need to warm him up more, Sarah said. She disappeared and returned with horse blankets, which they draped carefully over the calf. Then she sat down in the hay beside them, her body adding its warmth to theirs. Carter sat beside her, and they kept vigil together in the lantern light, watching the newborn fight to survive its first night. Thank you, Sarah said after a while, for letting us stay, for making Ethan welcome here, for caring. He's a good kid. He is. But most people don't see that. They see the autism, the silence, the difficulty. They don't see how gentle he is, how deeply he feels things. Her voice caught. That school in Seattle, the one his teachers recommended, they promise they can help him. But I keep thinking, help him be what? Normal? He doesn't need to be normal. He needs to be himself and to find places where himself is enough. Carter thought about Ethan's face when he was with the animals, the peace and belonging there. He thought about his own journey, about how this ranch had given him permission to be broken and still valuable, still needed. Bring him here, Carter said, as much as you want. Let him help with the animals. I'll teach him what I know, what Hank knows. Maybe that's the education he really needs. Sarah turned to look at him, lantern light catching tears on her cheeks. You mean that? I do. She leaned against him then, just for a moment, her head on his shoulder. Not romance, but something deeper. Connection. Recognition of shared struggle and shared hope. They sat that way until dawn began to gray the darkness. Two people keeping watch over new life in the middle of a storm that wanted nothing more than to erase everything fragile from the world. Morning brought no relief. If anything, the storm had intensified. Snow had drifted against the barn doors, 3 feet high in places. The wind had finally torn down the remaining western portion of the house roof that had been clinging precariously since Carter arrived. And through the barn's small windows, Carter could see the structure had collapsed completely now. The house that had barely survived 40 years of neglect had finally surrendered to the storm. Where rafters had once stood, only rubble remained, buried under snow. The world beyond was nothing but white, everything erased. Hank went to check on Raven and returned shaking his head in wonder. That wild stallion is calmer than I've ever seen him, standing in his stall like he was born to it, though he watches that door like he's counting the minutes until he can run. The day passed in strange suspension, time marked only by the need to feed animals, to keep the stove burning, to check and recheck that everyone was surviving. Ethan woke and immediately went to see the newborn calf, sitting beside it in the hay, his hand resting on its flank. The boy's presence seemed to calm the young animal, and Carter noticed the mother did not object, as if she recognized Ethan as safe. By afternoon, the food they had brought was running low. The storm showed no signs of breaking, and Carter began to worry about the animals in the field, the ones they had not been able to bring inside before the weather turned. 20 head of cattle out in the open, facing this Arctic fury. They'll find shelter, Hank said when Carter voiced his concern. Cattle are tough. They'll bunch together in a draw, wait it out. But Carter could not let it go. He kept thinking about them, cold and scared and alone. He thought about the newborn calf, how close it had come to dying. He thought about his father's words in the journal. We keep going because giving up is too easy. When evening came again, Carter made a decision. I'm going out to check on them, the ones we couldn't bring in. That's suicide, Hank said flatly. You can't see 10 feet in this. You'll get lost, freeze to death. I have to try. Sarah stood up, her face set with the same determination Carter felt. Then I'm coming with you. You need someone who knows what to look for with the animals. No, Carter said, Ethan needs you here. Ethan is safe with Hank. Those cattle might not be. She was already pulling on her heavy coat. We do this together or not at all. Carter looked at Hank, who shrugged. She's as stubborn as you are. And she's right. If you're going to do something this stupid, you shouldn't do it alone. They prepared carefully. Heavy coats, multiple layers, face masks against the wind. They tied a rope between themselves so they would not get separated. They took the most powerful flashlight, though Carter doubted it would penetrate far into the blizzard. And they told Hank that if they were not back in 2 hours, he should not come looking. Better 2 lost than 4. Stepping out of the barn was like stepping into chaos. The wind hit them with physical force, driving snow so hard it felt like needles against exposed skin. The cold was immediate and brutal, seeping through layers of clothing, finding every gap, every weakness. They could not talk, could barely see each other despite the rope connecting them. Carter led, following what he hoped was the right direction toward the far pasture where the cattle had been last seen. Sarah followed, one hand on the rope, the other holding the flashlight that showed them nothing but swirling white. Time became meaningless. They could have been walking for 10 minutes or an hour. Carter's face went numb. His fingers inside their gloves lost feeling. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on not falling, on not giving up. Then, through the howl of wind, he heard it. Cattle lowing, the sound distant but unmistakable. He changed direction, heading toward the sound, praying he was not leading them deeper into danger. They found the herd huddled in a natural depression, 20 head pressed together for warmth, covered in snow but alive. Most of them were standing, which was good, but 3 had gone down, and cattle that lay down in weather like this often did not get back up. Sarah moved among them immediately, checking, assessing, shouting something that Carter could not hear over the wind. She pointed at the 3 that were down, made a gesture that Carter understood. They had to get these animals up, had to get them moving, or they would freeze to death. What followed was brutal work. They hauled on the downed cattle, pushed and pulled, and shouted, trying to force exhausted animals to their feet. The first one responded, struggled up, staggered but standing. The second fought them, too tired or too cold to understand they were trying to help. But finally it too rose, joining the herd. The third would not move. A young heifer, probably only 2 years old, lay on her side with snow already drifting over her. Her eyes were open but glassy. She was shutting down, giving in to the cold. Carter knelt beside her, pulling off his gloves despite the insanity of it, pressing his bare hands against her neck, feeling for warmth, for life. Sarah was beside him, doing the same. Together, they rubbed the animal's body, trying to generate heat through friction, through sheer, stubborn refusal to let another life be taken by this storm. And slowly, so slowly it seemed impossible, the heifer responded, her eye focused. She shifted slightly, and with a groan that Carter felt more than heard, she rolled onto her chest. They pulled her the rest of the way up, and she stood, shaking but alive. The journey back to the barn was worse than the journey out. They were exhausted now, cold to the bone, and leading 21 cattle through a blizzard was like trying to herd water. But the animals seemed to understand that survival lay in following, and they came, a dark mass of bodies moving through white chaos. When they finally re-entered the barn, Carter could barely feel his hands. His face was so numb he was not sure he still had one. They drove the cattle inside, cramming them into the remaining space, And then Sarah and Carter collapsed in the office, shaking so hard their teeth rattled. Hank stripped off their wet outer layers and wrapped them in blankets, holding cups of hot coffee to their lips until they could grasp the cups themselves. Ethan watched from his corner, his dark eyes wide, and then he did something he had never done before. He came to Carter and put a small hand on Carter's shoulder. Just that. A touch. An acknowledgement. And then he returned to his corner. Sarah saw it, and tears streamed down her face. Though whether from cold or emotion or both, Carter could not tell. "You saved them," Hank said. "Damn fools that you are, you saved them." Carter sipped his coffee, feeling slowly returning to his extremities in the form of painful pins and needles. "Had to. My father would have done the same." "Your father would have called you an idiot for risking your life for cattle." "Maybe, but he would have risked his life too." Hank smiled, sad and knowing. "Yeah, he would have." The storm finally broke on the morning of the third day. Carter woke to silence. The absence of wind so profound it felt like deafness. He went to the barn door and pushed it open, snow falling away in a cascade. The world had been transformed. Snow covered everything, 3 feet deep in places, sculpted by wind into drifts that reached the barn's roof. The sun was rising in a sky of impossible blue, so clear and cold it hurt to look at. The land sparkled, white and pure and beautiful in a way that took his breath. The house was a ruin. The remaining roof had collapsed under the weight of snow and wind. It was gone now, truly gone, nothing left worth saving. But the barn stood, and inside the barn, every animal they had fought to protect had survived. Hank emerged from the office, stretching, wincing at the protest of old joints. He looked at the destroyed house and grunted. "Well, you needed a new house anyway." Despite everything, Carter laughed. It felt strange, that sound, rusty from disuse but genuine. "I suppose I did." Sarah and Ethan came out, the boy immediately going to check on his calf. The young animal was on its feet, nursing from its mother, the picture of health. 3 days old and already a survivor. Carter walked to the stable and looked into Raven's stall. The stallion stood alert, ears forward, watching the open door. The storm was over. The wild horse could leave any time he wanted. The stall door was still unlatched, still open. Raven looked at Carter, then at the door, then back at Carter, and he did not move. Not yet, that look seemed to say. Not ready to leave yet. Carter understood. He was not ready either. This place, these people, these animals. They had survived the storm together. They had become something more than strangers sharing shelter. They had become what Hank and his father had been, what his father had hoped Carter could become. A family bound not by blood, but by choice, by showing up, by caring when it would have been easier not to. As the sun climbed higher and began the long work of melting snow, Carter stood in the barn doorway with Hank beside him, Sarah and Ethan behind them, and all the animals they had saved sheltering in the warmth they had fought to preserve. The ranch had tested him. The storm had tested him, and he had not broken. He had survived. And in surviving, he had found what he had been searching for all along. A reason to keep going. A purpose worth the struggle. A home. The work of recovery began the day after the storm passed. Carter stood in what had been his father's house, or what remained of it, which was almost nothing. The collapsed roof had taken most of the walls with it, leaving only the stone chimney standing like a monument to what had been. Snow had drifted through the ruins, covering the floor where he had slept, burying the furniture that had survived 40 years only to be destroyed in 3 days. Hank stood beside him, surveying the wreckage with the practical eye of a man who had seen plenty of destruction in his long life. Foundation still good, chimney solid, you could rebuild. Carter picked up a piece of timber that had been a roof beam, feeling its weight, its solidity despite being broken. "Yeah, I could." The question was not whether he could, but whether he would. Whether this place, this land, was worth the years of work it would take to make it whole again. Whether he was ready to commit not just 30 days, but the rest of his life to this ranch and everything it represented. He thought about the storm, about fighting through the blizzard to save cattle that were not even his by any real measure, about sitting in the barn with Sarah and Hank and Ethan, a makeshift family bound together by necessity and choice, about Raven, the wild stallion who had chosen shelter over freedom, if only for a while. And he thought about his father, alone in this house, keeping it going year after year, despite knowing his son was never coming back, keeping it ready, keeping it alive, waiting. "I'm going to rebuild," Carter said. "Not the same house, Something new, but here, on this spot. Hank smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Good, you'll need help. I can't pay much. Didn't ask for pay, asked if you needed help. Over the next week, as the snow slowly melted and the land began to emerge from winter's grip, others arrived. Word had spread through the small community about Carter's decision to stay, about the storm and the rescue, and the commitment he had shown. And people came. The pastor from the town church arrived with his truck full of lumber he had collected from his congregation. Your father was a good man, difficult, but good. He helped people when they needed it, even if he never talked about it. Time to return the favor. 3 ranchers from neighboring properties showed up with tools and experience and strong backs. We're all in this together out here. When one of us falls, we all help them back up. Even Red McCarthy appeared, the old man who had challenged Carter in the bar that first night. Red stood looking at the ruins, then at Carter, and something passed between them. An understanding, an acknowledgement that grudges were luxuries men could not afford when survival was at stake. Your father and I had our differences, Red said, but he was a rancher. You're proving to be one too. That counts for something. They worked through early spring, rebuilding not just a house, but something larger. The new structure rose on the old foundation, but it was different, smaller, more practical, built to withstand Montana winters and the passage of time. Carter designed it himself, drawing on skills from his years before the military, finding that the architecture training he had abandoned decades ago still lived in his hands and mind. The house took shape slowly, frame first, then walls, then roof, each board placed with care, each nail driven true. Carter worked alongside the volunteers, learning their names, hearing their stories, becoming part of the fabric of this place in ways his father never quite had. Sarah came often with Ethan, and the boy proved surprisingly helpful. He could not communicate verbally about what needed doing, but he understood tools and materials with an intuitive sense that amazed the men. He would hand Carter the right wrench before being asked, would steady boards at exactly the right moment. And in the evenings, he would sit with the animals, especially the calf that had been born during the storm, which he had quietly named Hope, though he never spoke the name aloud. Sarah told Carter, and the name stuck. One afternoon while they were working on the porch, Sarah sat beside Carter during a water break. She had been quiet all day, thoughtful in a way that suggested important words were gathering. I told the school no, she said finally, about sending Ethan to Seattle. Carter waited, knowing there was more. I talked to his teachers, to the administrators, told them that Ethan was doing better than he had in years, that he had found something here that worked for him. They were skeptical, said I was being emotional, not practical. She smiled, but it was edged with defiance. So I quit my job. You did what? I quit, gave my notice. I'm opening my own practice based here. Mobile veterinary service for the ranches in this area. And I'm going to homeschool Ethan, let him learn by doing, by working with animals and land. She turned to look at Carter directly. If that's okay with you. If you'll let him keep coming here, keep learning from you and Hank. Carter felt emotion tighten his throat. Of course it's okay, more than okay. He's happy here. For the first time in his life, he's genuinely happy. I can't send him away from that. I won't. They sat in silence for a while, watching Ethan down by the barn, the boy moving among the animals with a grace and confidence he showed nowhere else. You're building a good thing here, Sarah said quietly. Not just a house, a place where broken things can heal. We're all broken, Carter said. I'm starting to think that's not the problem. The problem is when we're broken alone. As spring deepened into summer, the house was completed. It was not grand, but it was solid and true. Carter moved his few belongings into it, and for the first time since returning to Montana, he slept under a real roof, in a real bed. The nightmares still came occasionally, but they were losing their power. The work and the purpose in the presence of others had begun to heal wounds he had carried for decades. One evening in late June, Hank asked Carter to take a walk with him. They headed out toward the high pasture where ravens still ranged. The stallion had left his shelter in the barn as soon as the storm cleared, but he had not gone far. He stayed close to the ranch, close enough that Carter saw him most days, watching from a ridge or grazing in the far meadow. When they reached the high ground, Hank sat on a boulder and gestured for Carter to join him. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Below them, the ranch spread out like a living map, the new house bright against the land, the barn and outbuildings clustered around it. the cattle grazing in the green pastures. Your father used to come up here, Hank said, especially near the end. He'd sit on this rock and look down at what he'd built, what he'd kept alive. And I think he'd wonder if it mattered, if anyone would care after he was gone. Carter felt the weight of those words, the loneliness they implied. I want to show you something, Hank continued. He pulled out his wallet, old and cracked, and from it extracted a folded piece of paper, yellowed and worn. Your father gave this to me about a year before he died. Made me promise not to show you until you decided to stay. He said if you left after 30 days, it would just cause pain. But if you stayed, you needed to see it. Carter took the paper with trembling hands. He unfolded it carefully, recognizing his father's handwriting immediately. It was a letter addressed to him. Carter, if Hank is showing you this, it means you stayed. It means you gave this land a chance. I'm grateful for that, son. More grateful than I know how to say. There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you 40 years ago but didn't, because I was too proud and too stupid and too scared. When you left after our fight, when you joined the Marines, I was angry. I told myself you were weak, that you were running away from responsibility. But the truth is I was terrified. Terrified that I had driven away the only thing in my life that mattered. Terrified that I had become my father. Hard and cold and unable to show love even when I felt it. Your mother knew. She always knew. Before she died, she made me promise to tell you that I loved you, that I was proud of you, that the hardness was my failure, not yours. But after she was gone, I couldn't find the words. Every time I tried to call, to write, I froze up. The silence became its own kind of prison. So I kept this ranch going, not for profit, not for pride, but because it was the only way I knew to tell you that I was sorry, that I was waiting, that there would always be a place for you here, no matter how much time passed, no matter what happened between us. I know I failed you as a father. I know I drove you away when I should have held you close. But I want you to know that every animal I cared for, every fence I mended, every sunrise I watched from this land, I was thinking of you, hoping you were safe, hoping you were happy, hoping that one day you might forgive an old man who loved you but never learned to say it out loud. This ranch is my apology, my love letter, my prayer that you might find here what I found, what kept me alive all these years. Purpose, peace, a reason to wake up and keep going. If you're reading this, you've already started to understand. You've already begun to heal. And that means more to me than any words you could speak or any visit you could make. I'm proud of you, son. I was always proud of you. I'm sorry I never told you that when it might have mattered. Take care of this land. Take care of these animals. And take care of yourself. That's all I ever wanted for you. Your father, Robert McKenzie. Carter read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face without shame or restraint. All the years of anger, all the resentment and hurt and blame melted in the face of these words. His father had been trying in the only way he knew how, had been reaching out across the silence, using the land as a language because words had failed him. Hank sat quietly beside him, giving him space to grieve and heal and come to terms with a truth that changed everything. He loved you, Hank said finally. He just didn't know how to show it in ways you could understand until he gave you the one thing he knew how to give, a place to belong. Carter folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket, where he would carry it close to his heart. I wish I had known. I wish I had come back sooner. He wouldn't have wanted you to carry that regret. He'd want you to take what he left and make it into something more, something better. They sat together as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the stars began to emerge. And Carter understood that forgiveness was not about forgetting or excusing. It was about accepting the imperfect love that had been offered and choosing to build something better from it. As summer turned toward fall, Carter made a decision. He called a meeting at the ranch, inviting not just Hank and Sarah, but the other ranchers who had helped rebuild, the pastor, the townspeople who had shown up when he needed them. They gathered in the new house, filling the living room, spilling out onto the porch. Carter stood before them, nervous in a way he had not been since his military days, and spoke from the heart. Most of you know my story, how I left this place 40 years ago and only came back because my father's will forced me to. I thought I was coming back to settle an estate and move on. But this land had other plans. He paused, gathering his thoughts. My father left me more than property. He left me a charge, to care for things that can't care for themselves, to show up even when it's hard, to build something that matters. Carter looked around at the faces watching him, seeing acceptance and understanding. I want to expand on that. I want to turn this ranch into something more. A place where veterans dealing with PTSD can come to work and heal. Where kids like Ethan, who don't fit the regular world, can find their place. Where anyone who's struggling can find purpose through caring for animals and land. Sarah smiled, tears in her eyes. Hank nodded slowly, approval clear in his weathered face. It won't be easy, Carter continued. It won't be profitable. But I think it's what this place was always meant to be. A sanctuary, not just for animals, but for people who need a second chance. The room was silent for a moment. Then the pastor stood. I think that's exactly what this community needs. Count the church in. We'll help however we can. Others stood, offering support, offering to volunteer, offering to spread the word. By the end of the evening, Carter's small idea had grown into something larger than he had imagined. A real plan, a real mission. The McKenzie Ranch, which had been one man's lonely vigil, would become a place of healing and second chances. A legacy worth preserving. Over the following months, the vision took shape. Carter worked with Sarah to develop programs for working with veterans and troubled youth. They brought in their first resident, a young Marine named Danny, who had come back from deployment unable to adjust to civilian life. Danny reminded Carter of himself, hollow-eyed and lost. But after a week of working with the cattle, of having something depend on him showing up every morning, a change began. More followed. An older veteran from Vietnam who had been living on the streets. A teenage girl whose parents could not handle her autism. A man in his 50s who had lost his job and his sense of worth. One by one they came, and one by one the land began to work its quiet magic. Ethan became an unofficial guide for the younger visitors, showing them how to approach the animals, how to read their needs. The boy who could not speak became eloquent in his actions, teaching through example. And Carter watched him with pride, seeing what Sarah had always known, that being different was not the same as being broken. On a cold morning in October, Carter was in the barn when he heard the sound of hooves. He looked up to see Raven standing in the doorway, backlit by the rising sun. The stallion had not entered the barn since the storm, had maintained his distance and his freedom. But now he stood there, looking at Carter with those intelligent, dark eyes. Carter approached slowly, hand outstretched, not expecting anything. But Raven did not shy away. He allowed Carter to touch his neck, to stroke his mane, to feel the power and life beneath his hand. "You don't have to stay," Carter said quietly. "You're free. You've always been free." But Raven remained, and Carter understood. Freedom and belonging were not opposites. The stallion had chosen to return not because he was tamed, but because he had found a place worth returning to. Later that day, as Carter was working on extending the barn to accommodate more animals, a truck pulled up that he did not recognize. A woman got out, probably in her 40s, with a teenage girl beside her. They approached hesitantly, and Carter saw the familiar look of desperation mixed with hope. "Are you Carter McKenzie?" the woman asked. "I am. I heard about what you're doing here, about the sanctuary. My daughter, she's been struggling. Depression, anxiety, nothing seems to help. Her therapist suggested maybe working with animals might reach her when nothing else can." The woman's voice broke. "We're out of options. I'm willing to try anything." Carter looked at the girl, saw the emptiness in her eyes that he knew so well, saw himself at countless points in his journey, and he saw an opportunity to do for her what this land had done for him. "We have a new calf that needs bottle feeding. Think you could help with that?" The girl looked up for the first time, a flicker of interest breaking through the numbness. "I guess." "Come on then, I'll introduce you." As they walked toward the barn, Sarah emerged from the house where she had been reviewing veterinary records. She saw Carter with the new arrivals and smiled, understanding immediately what was happening. More broken souls finding their way to this place. More chances to heal. That evening, after the woman and her daughter had left with promises to return the next day, after Ethan had been picked up by Sarah, after the last of the work was done, Carter and Hank sat on the porch of the new house and watched the sun set over the land. "You've built something good here," Hank said. "Something that'll outlast both of us." "We built it. You and me and everyone who helped." "No," Hank said firmly. "Your father built the foundation. He just didn't live to see what could be raised on it. But he knew, that's why he left it to you, because he trusted you to see the possibilities." Carter thought about his father, about the journal entries and the final letter, about a man who loved him perfectly but deeply. "I wish I could tell him I understand now. that I forgive him, that I'm grateful. He knows, Hank said. Somehow, I think he knows. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered and stars emerged. From the barn came the sounds of animals settling for the night. From the pasture, the distant call of cattle. From somewhere in the high country, ravens answering whinny, wild and free, but no longer alone. This was home. Not the building, not the land itself, but the life that filled it, the purpose that drove it, the connections that made it matter. Carter thought about the man he had been when he arrived. Hollow, purposeless, counting down days until he could leave. And he thought about who he had become. Not fixed, not perfect, but whole in a way he had not been for years. Part of something larger than himself. The next morning began as all mornings now did. Carter rose before dawn, made coffee in the kitchen of his new house, and walked out to greet the day. The air was sharp with coming winter, frost glittering on the grass. His breath fogged in the cold, and he felt alive in a way he had forgotten was possible. Hank's truck pulled up right on schedule, and together they began the morning feeding. The work was familiar now, comfortable, a meditation in motion. Check the water, distribute the feed, inspect each animal for signs of illness or injury. Simple tasks, but they mattered. They anchored him to this place, to this purpose. As they worked, Carter noticed movement on the ridge above the ranch. Raven stood there, silhouetted against the rising sun, watching over the land like a sentinel. The stallion had not returned to captivity, but he had not left either. He had found a middle path, belonging without surrender, present by choice rather than compulsion. Carter understood that was what they were all doing here, finding ways to belong without losing themselves, healing without forgetting what had broken them, moving forward while honoring what had come before. Later that week, Carter received a letter from the county, official paperwork recognizing the McKenzie Ranch as a nonprofit sanctuary, granting it tax-exempt status and opening doors for funding and support. What had started as one man's desperate attempt to honor his father's memory had become an institution, something that would outlive them all. He showed the letter to Hank, who read it carefully and then smiled. Your father would never believe it. He spent his whole life barely holding on, and you've turned it into something that'll help people for generations. I had help, Carter said. I had you and Sarah and everyone who showed up. That's how it works out here. Nobody makes it alone. Your father learned that too late. You learned it just in time. On Thanksgiving, Carter hosted dinner at the ranch. It was not a traditional gathering. Sarah came with Ethan. Hank brought his daughter, who he had finally reconciled with after years of estrangement. The sanctuary's work, helping to bridge old wounds. The pastor came with his wife. Several of the volunteers came with their families. And 3 of the people staying at the sanctuary, learning to heal through work and purpose, joined them. They crowded into the new house, filling it with voices and laughter and the smell of food. Carter stood at the head of the table, looking at the faces around him, and felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. A year ago, he had been alone in an empty apartment, going through motions of life without living. Now he was surrounded by people who had become family, not through blood, but through choice and shared struggle. When it came time to say grace, the pastor asked Carter to speak. He stood, uncomfortable with the attention, but recognizing the importance of the moment. I'm not good at speeches, he began, but I want to say thank you to all of you. A year ago, I came to this ranch because I was forced to. I planned to do my time and leave, but you all taught me something my father tried to tell me, and I was too stubborn to hear. He paused, feeling emotion rise. You taught me that purpose doesn't come from comfort or security. It comes from having something worth protecting, someone worth showing up for. And you taught me that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about choosing to care, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Carter raised his glass to second chances, to healing, and to everyone who shows up day after day to do the work that matters. They drank, and then the meal began, and the house filled with the warmth of people who belonged together. Later, when the guests had gone and Carter was alone, he walked out to the barn one last time before bed. The animals were settled, safe and warm. He checked on each one, touching their flanks, speaking soft words, making sure all was well. In the back stall, Hope the calf, now half-grown, nuzzled his hand. This animal had been born in the middle of a blizzard, had fought for every breath, and now thrived, a living symbol of resilience and possibility. Carter pulled his father's letter from his pocket, where he carried it always. He read it again by the light of the barn's single bulb, the words as powerful as the first time. This ranch is my apology, my love letter, my prayer. I hear you now, Dad, Carter said to the quiet barn, to the animals, to the ghost of a man who had loved imperfectly but deeply. I understand, and I'm going to make sure this place does what you hoped it would do. I'm going to make sure it helps people the way it helped me. The animals shifted in their stalls, content and calm. And Carter felt his father's presence, not as a ghost, but as a legacy, as a foundation upon which to build something that would outlast them both. He walked back to the house under a sky brilliant with stars. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the smell of wood fire and home. Lights glowed in the windows, warm and welcoming. And Carter McKenzie, who had spent so many years lost and alone, walked through his door and found exactly what he had been searching for without knowing it. Peace, purpose, belonging. The ranch that had been his father's life's work was now his own, but it was more than that. It was a sanctuary for everyone who had been broken by life and needed a place to heal. A place where showing up mattered, where caring was enough, where second chances were not just possible but promised. As he lay in bed that night, listening to the wind move through the Montana hills, Carter thought about the journey that had brought him here. All the pain and loss and struggle, all the years of wandering, all the choices, good and bad, that had led to this moment. And he understood that some roads only make sense when you look back at them, that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what matters, that the hardest journeys often lead to the destinations you needed most. His father had known that, had left him not an inheritance but a map, a way home, a way back to himself. Carter closed his eyes and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, slept through the night without nightmares. He slept the sleep of a man who had found his purpose, who had something worth waking up for, who had finally, after 40 years of running, come home. And in the morning he would wake before dawn and do it all again. Feed the animals, mend what was broken, show up for people who needed someone to show up for them. It was not glamorous work. It was not easy work. But it was work that mattered. And that made all the difference. The sun would rise over the McKenzie Ranch, as it had for 70 years, as it would for 70 more. The land would endure. The animals would thrive. And the people who came here broken would leave a little more whole, carrying with them the knowledge that they were not alone, that they were not beyond healing, that there were places in this world where showing up and caring was enough. Places like this. Sanctuaries built not from stone and timber, but from stubbornness and hope, and the quiet determination to keep going when giving up would be easier. Places his father had dreamed of, but never quite achieved. Places Carter was building, one day at a time, one broken soul at a time, on the foundation his father had left him. This was the promise, the last cowboy's promise, to keep showing up, to keep caring, to keep the sanctuary alive for everyone who needed it. And Carter McKenzie intended to keep that promise for as long as he had breath in his body and strength in his hands. The ranch was no longer just land. It was legacy. It was love. It was home. And it always would be.